Before I say anything else, let me make one thing clear. Resident Evil Village is a good game and far from the worst entry in the series. Its art direction is striking, the exploration and gameplay are strong, and Lady Dimitrescu is an iconic, if underused, villain. The game immediately hooks you in its opening hours, a shocking intro that completely upends your expectations, followed by a tense cinematic section in the village, topped off by the game's highlight, the castle. But as the game goes on, the cracks in its design philosophy start to appear. Unlike earlier titles, which focused either fully on survival horror or pure action, Village attempts to mix every aspect of the series into one game. The result is an awkward mess that feels confused in its identity and cannot commit to anything. And this confusion is cemented in the design of the different gameplay styles and in the game's structure. Resident Evil Requiem has many of the same aspirations that Village did. It mixes survival horror with action horror in an attempt to bring together the fans of RE1, 2 and 7 with those of RE4. Unlike Village, however, Requiem establishes clear narrative justifications for it, fully commits to both experiences and structures them in a way that is borderline genius. This is how Requiem succeeds where Village failed. But before we get into that, hi, I'm Jerry and welcome to my channel Scharfsinn, a place for game reviews, essays, news and the occasional analysis about a variety of video games from many different genres. I also like to write reviews over on Backlogged to share my immediate experiences with the games I play. If you're interested in any of that, I'd be glad to see you stick around. But now let's get started. In order to properly talk about survival horror and action horror and all the ways that Village and Requiem actualize these concepts, we need to be on the same page about what they even are. Survival horror is a term that commonly refers to the types of experiences found in the original Resident Evil games up until 3 and Resident Evil 7. What unites these experiences is the fact that you have very limited resources, inventory space and health. You can fight back against most enemies, but since you have so little ammo, every bullet fired is a conscious choice. And since your inventory space is so small, every item you pick up and carry with you is also a conscious choice. This leads to a deliberate gameplay experience that demands your constant attention. Action horror is basically the exact opposite of that. Plenty of resources, inventory space, health, a focus on combat, and plenty of guns as well as kick-ass moves. The gold standard here is of course Resident Evil 4, and speaking for myself, the remake of that game, since I haven't played the original yet. I know I must catch up on that. It's a completely different kind of experience because you can afford to experiment and use your resources liberally. Reflexes matter a whole lot more than strategy, but if done well, it's no less exhilarating, if not more so. How does Village try to combine these vastly different experiences? Essentially, it divides them into different levels. After a brief opening section, the game thrusts you into its titular and central location, the Village. It acts as a hub that you return to after each and every subsequent level. These are directly connected to the village and scattered around its far ends. In brief, there is the Castle Dimitrescu, the House Beneviento, the Reservoir, and Heisenberg's factory. Every single one of these areas offers a different kind of experience and comes with its own antagonist even, each quirkier than the last. The village starts out with an action-heavy set-piece reminiscent of the opening of Resident Evil 4, before becoming more of a place for slow-paced exploration and stealth. The Castle Dimitrescu takes this a step further by offering the most classic survival horror experience in the entire game. Puzzles, a stalker enemy that hunts you, backtracking, limited resources, it's all there. After a slightly underwhelming boss fight against the lady of the house, you're back in the village again before setting foot into the game's most notorious level, House Beneviento. This section is pure horror. The house feels eerily quiet at first. There are no enemies and there's no combat whatsoever, it's just exploration and puzzle solving. As you descend into the basement, the tension only grows and eventually releases into the game's most bone-chilling moment. You hear a baby crying, but it's not a regular baby. And before long you see an oversized and distorted toddler the size of the entire hallway crawling towards you. You make your escape from the basement only to find yourself in a sea of dolls, where you have to find and kill Lady Beneviento, who appears to you in the form of one of them. By now, we've reached the halfway point of the game. While it has drastically shifted in tone and gameplay in these opening hours, there is still a sense of cohesion and rhythm to the experience. The village is a mix of action and survival horror, the castle leans further into survival horror and only occasionally into action, while House Beneviento focuses entirely on horror. The second half of the game leans much more strongly into action while making half-hearted attempts at facilitating classic exploration. Neither survival horror nor action gets to shine fully. On top of that, the switch in tone between its eerie atmosphere and over-the-top boss fights is increasingly jarring. What ultimately happens then is that Village stops feeling like a singular vision and more like an amalgamation of popular aspects of the series. Taken individually, specific sections of the game are strong and confident. Taken as a whole, it becomes increasingly apparent how often and abruptly the game tries to be something else entirely and thus flip-flops between its ambitions. The worst part is in how this hamstrings the very mechanics of the gameplay. In order to facilitate proper action, the protagonist even must have access to a roster of weapons, be powerful enough to dispatch a variety of enemies and have plenty of inventory space to carry large amounts of ammo. But how can you make a potent survival horror section within that framework that doesn't feel like a forced downgrade in power? And vice versa, how could you give Ethan limited inventory and resources to facilitate classic survival horror while also trying to enable fist-pumping action sequences? As Village shows, the result must be a compromise that works for both but excels in neither. Ethan cannot be an overpowered killing machine and then be totally defenseless against an oversized baby. This compromise limits the abilities that Ethan can and cannot have because maintaining the immersion the game so carefully tries to build could break under any small imbalance. And ironically, by trying to warp this balance, Village barely keeps itself upright. So, how does Requiem solve this? Instead of trying to juggle all these balls with just 2 hands, well, it uses 4. The producer of Resident Evil Requiem once said in an interview that trying to make a new game in the series focused on survival horror featuring Leon wouldn't work. The reason is that Leon as a character has long evolved from someone who could be scared by monsters in the dark to someone who just sees them as a bump in the road. He's a trained, experienced agent who has been through this many times before. By default, you couldn't make a level like House Beneviento with Leon that feels right. So instead of trying to capture both experiences within a single character's story, it splits these experiences up completely. In Requiem, you play as 2 characters, Leon and Grace, and essentially playing as these 2 feels like playing 2 entirely different games. Leon sections focus on pure action and offer a similar gameplay experience to that of the Resident Evil 4 remake. Plenty of guns, ammo, the ability to parry enemy attacks and perform various melee attacks and finishes. There's not a single moment with Leon where you don't feel fully in control. Grace is the total opposite. Her parts are 100% survival horror, and arguably even more so than games such as Resident Evil 2 or 7. While every enemy poses a genuine threat in those games, your roster of weapons expands over time, which increases your sense of control as well. Grace's sections in Requiem don't do that. Throughout the entire game, you are limited to a pistol and the Requiem hand cannon, as far as ranged weapons go. There are more ways to deal with enemies, like the hemolytic injectors that let you take down enemies up close and the occasional Molotov cocktail. Still, progression as Grace is deliberately limited so that you never gain too much confidence. In her sections, every enemy is a serious threat to both your health and your resources, causing you to always feel on edge. And this is mirrored in Grace's characterization and story. She is an FBI analyst with no field experience whatsoever and with a lingering trauma of seeing her mother brutally murdered in front of her. She is inexperienced, underpowered, unprepared, and easily scared. Requiem justifies the gameplay split with its narrative. Placing Grace into Leon's sections and vice versa wouldn't work because of how intrinsically their characterization is tied to a respective gameplay experience. Furthermore, by separating the 2, Requiem doesn't need to compromise on either. Leon can have his roundhouse kicks and headshot parries without it impeding on the parts where you have to hide in a corner as Grace to avoid the girl. It doesn't have to juggle an inventory size or roster of weapons that fits both experiences like Village tried to do. Also, Requiem lets you choose between a first-person perspective akin to Resident Evil 7 and a third-person perspective like in Resident Evil 4, and this goes for both characters. The game, however, explicitly recommends picking first-person for Grace and third-person for Leon, and I couldn't agree more. Grace's sections are much more intense and claustrophobic in first person, while Leon's feel too cramped. Having the option to customize it to your liking is great, especially for a second playthrough, but it's a compromise that I personally could have done without. Switching perspectives cements the difference between Leon and Grace. Playing both in third person feels fine, and seeing Grace stumble brings its own style of tension, but it still diminishes the effect. And playing as Leon in first person is just straight up psychopathic behavior. There is an inherent issue that could have arisen from Requiem's dual structure. It could easily have felt like two games forced into one, but in a clever move, the game sidesteps this problem. Unlike Resident Evil 6, which also had multiple playable characters but divided their stories into separate campaigns, Requiem regularly cuts between Grace and Leon. The result is that it builds tension in Grace's sections and then releases it in Leon's. This works wonders for the game's pacing by creating constant variety and ensuring that neither experience overstays its welcome. Unlike Village, Requiem always makes a hard cut, and it works not in spite, but because of how different its two halves are. It takes this a step further by letting you experience one of the game's central locations as Grace first and then as Leon. What could easily be construed as lazy recycling of levels in other games, even in this very franchise, only serves to highlight this contrast. The Rhodes Hill Care Center is utterly transformed based on which character you experience it as. Where you had to sneak through its hallways as Grace, you can breeze through them as Leon. And this order is important too because it would feel strange to first experience the care center as Leon and then as Grace. The delicate cycle of tension and release would be reversed and it just would not work. On top of that, this level isn't entirely repeated as both characters still have sections distinct to them and Leon's part is much shorter. It's such a careful balance that could easily fall apart, but Requiem never does. A few sections go on for too long, such as the Raccoon City Center, which could have used a pure horror section as Grace in between, but that's a minor complaint. Resident Evil Village tried to mix every kind of Resident Evil experience into a single cocktail. Through its theme park-esque structure and constant gameplay compromise, it ultimately doesn't do any genre justice. This is where Requiem succeeds, as it clearly separates survival horror and action into two distinct characters, it justifies this division through its story, and seesaws between the two in a way that keeps the experience fresh until the last second. Whether or not this structure can work for multiple games in the series going forward, we'll have to wait and see. Here and now though, it's the culmination of everything the series has worked up to since Resident Evil 7. Survival horror and action horror can be united in a single game, and Requiem is the proof that Village wasn't.